Welcome to Meld. My name is Josh Gonzalez, and this is a podcast where I have in-depth conversations with some of the brightest people in the known universe. My aim here is to spark a deep conversation around interesting topics to find the tools, tactics, and philosophies that we can all use in our daily and creative lives. In this episode, I sat down with Stephanie Andrews, the CEO of Origins Media House. Origins is a full-service podcast production agency that helps bring big brand shows to life. Now, I've been wanting to have Steph on this podcast since the very beginning of the show so that she could share with me all of her wisdom on how to successfully start and grow a podcast, which is exactly what we talk about in this episode. She shares so many great tips and strategies on creating a podcast that actually matters, as well as how to grow your show and actually get a lot of listeners. This will be particularly useful if you're thinking of starting a podcast yourself or if you're trying to grow a podcast that you already have. But if you don't have a podcast, this will also be an interesting and insightful episode for you to listen to. Being a female CEO of a media company, Steph also shares her wisdom on creating a positive company culture and how to be a great leader to your team. She tells some horror stories of working in the tech bro culture and the toxic masculinity that pushed her to start a company of mostly women, along with 2 other female co-founders. Steph is also a passionate yogi who does her best to take lessons learned from the yoga mat into the world around her. And from that, we talk a little bit about psychedelics, yoga, and how to cultivate a positive mindset, as well as tools and techniques to care for your mental health. If you want to connect with Steph, learn a little bit more about Origins Media House, or just dive into any of the topics that we talk about in this episode, please go to the first link in the description of this podcast, where you can get access to full show notes and direct links to some of the things we talk about. And if you find anything in this episode useful or interesting, please connect with me on Twitter or Instagram at @JoshGonzalez_. The links are in the description as well. And please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do have an iPhone, please review this on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. It helps a lot. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm Josh Gonzalez, and this is Meld with Stephanie Andrews. Steph, thank you so much for coming on Meld. Thank you so much for taking the time and, being able to chat with me on here.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's been a while, and usually we chat because we had this shared office space at Transmedia Zone, and that was sort of like the serendipity moment where we would always see what each other are working on. We can kind of hang out in a sense that you can be working on your company, I'm working on mine, but we can always get a shared sense of where each other are at. But I feel like over the last couple months we've been completely distant, and everyone's been working in their own little bubble. So it's good to have you on here, and I just want to know sort of what you've been up to and how you've been sort of dealing with this new normal with COVID happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different world for sure. And I think it's funny that you touched on the Transmedia Zone and the shared space, because I think overall, I would say that's probably the thing that I miss the most, although I used to complain about the most, which I'll get into, is I really miss seeing everyone and interacting with everyone and getting inspired by all the incredible people that are in our space. And you don't realize how much really that impacts you until you no longer have it. And it's funny because when we were in that space, I remember our company just is crazy all the time. And we're always heads underwater trying to figure out what's going on. And so it was funny because people would always come up to me and talk to me or whatever. And normally I took it for granted while we were in the space. Cause as much as I do love hanging out and I love talking to you and Anthony and all the other amazing people that are in the space, there were certain times where I was oh my God, I want to talk to everyone, but I also I have an hour to get this proposal out. I'm literally dying. And then we went remote and now I'm kind of oh, well, I miss everyone.
I know. But how has it changed your workflow? Obviously you probably get a lot more done, because I know I always get more done when I'm working from home.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's funny because the company early days, like we didn't have an office, like we were fully remote. We would work out of coffee shops and stuff. And all we wanted was an office. That's literally everything we wanted. And then we got an office and it was great. Now we're back remote. And I'm like, wow, we really don't need an office at all. Like it's wild. And our whole team's been remote. We went remote. I think it was on like, the weekend where everything kind of broke out. So I remember taking the team entirely remote. We were like, okay, we're just going to over communicate. We're going to Slack each other all the time. We're going to do video calls. Like this is going to be okay. And I remember being really nervous about it because our team is very much a team that is very tight knit. We like really close interaction. We talk all the time. And I was worried about how that was going to affect our workflow and our communications. And honestly, it's been completely fine. I'm so much more productive. I feel like I have a routine, which is something that I've never had in my entire life. Like I get up at 6 a.m. and I do my yoga on the balcony and then come on in and work all day. And it's great. So even like past COVID, I think what's going to happen is we're just going to do kind of like a hybrid of this where it's going to be mostly remote. And I think the money that we had pooled for rent, I'm just going to split it between our team members and then they can use it to, go to coffee shops or get a co-working space or whatever they want, because why pay for rent if we're not going to use it? Less productive.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the model. And even before COVID, that was sort of our model. Like, we were only in the office maybe once or twice a week, if we had like team meetings in person. But other than that, we're working remotely because most of the time it is over Slack, or you can do a Zoom call and get some FaceTime. But I think like what's really cool that you just brought up is like giving people the option to either come in or save that money on rent and be like, hey, use it however you would like. Do you want to use like flex days or WeWork or however you want to work? Like, you don't have to be in the same physical space anymore. And I think that's sort of like...
Sorry, one sec. Someone's just knocking on my door. Give me 2 seconds. So
no
sorry.
Worries.
I'm so sorry. What were we talking about?
It's all good. You know what? This is good. We're talking about sort of like the remote work, but I think that will definitely come up again because it's like kind of like the how we work. What I really want to actually talk about right now, we kind of glossed over, is what we're working on. And I kind of want to hear from you what you guys are working on. But, over the last couple months, I'd love to see how you guys evolved and what kind of work you've been doing over the last little while.
Oh my Lord. It's hard to even put it into words, honestly. It's funny because, I look at what we've been doing for the past few months and I just feel so incredibly grateful. I think that is the word that I have used predominantly throughout this entire COVID experience, because the day that we all went remote, there was like that week where everyone was really unsure. And honestly, like being an entrepreneur, I was like, oh my God, like we can't record our podcast in studio. What are we going to do? Remote options aren't as strong. Like, and I was freaking out. I was like, I think like this could be the end. Like, and I had basically accepted our death sentence. Not that we didn't have a ton of runway, like we were fine for at least a couple of months. Then all of a sudden we just started landing clients like left and right. It was wild because I guess everyone had all this time at home and was like, all right, it's time to start a podcast. And even brands were like, okay, well, how are we going to reach our consumers? Podcasts, because everyone's at home, they're consuming more media. So we were lucky enough to land RBC. So we work on RBC disruptors. We've landed Axway, which we work with their Mr. Open Banking podcast, which is a really interesting take on kind of a documentary style take on the open banking movement and how that's taking place around the world. And that's really cool because we get to interview people in the UK and Australia and Tokyo. And we get to do it all remotely from our living rooms, which is really interesting. And other ones we're working on Joyful Sundays with Jody Kovitz. Jody is the CEO and founder of Move Dial, which is an organization that is helping advance women in tech, which is something I'm super passionate about because that's where I started my career, was in tech with a bunch of dudes, which is fine. But
we'll definitely get into that. That's an interesting topic for me for sure.
Yeah, I have some stories. So that's been really interesting, and that's a really cool podcast because she just, interviews like really inspiring leaders about like how you become your best self, which is something I'm super psyched about. Another one we're working on is called Field Tripping, which is all about psychedelics and psychedelic experiences.
I didn't realize it was you guys. I was following their website and I saw that they posted the podcast and I started listening to it. It's awesome. I didn't realize you guys produced it.
Yeah, we do. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite topics because I'm really into like how do you expand your consciousness? And I mean, you've probably heard me talk about like my yoga and meditation practice all the time. So yeah, like the psychedelic podcast is really interesting because we talk about like integrative medicine and like how that like benefits your health and mental health and all that stuff, which is really cool. Yeah, so those are a few. And then we have our original series and a couple other client ones that I can't quite talk about yet. In the next few months, I will be able to, but yeah, it's pretty wild.
That sounds so exciting. I mean, there's kind of two things in there that are really, really cool. The first being, how remote podcasting has opened up this whole new world for you. You're interviewing people that you would never otherwise interview. And I think for me, over the last couple of months, like me starting this podcast was all about, okay, more people are going to be on Zoom, more people are going to be used to video calls. So, people have been super open to doing these remote podcasting. And for me, it's honestly better than having to like, hey, come meet me at the studio or something. I'll set everything up. And that's what we used to do. And in my first podcast, Think Tank, we traveled all the way to Silicon Valley to do a series of talks for like VR companies. And we went to the Facebook headquarters, which, don't get me wrong, is cool. It got us into the Facebook headquarters to like do podcasting with some of their employees. But then also like that's like a lot of work just to get an interview where now you can just do it online, right?
Oh yeah, it's so cool. I mean, as much as I do love traveling, and so I do kind of wish I could go to Tokyo just to interview someone. Yeah. It is amazing, and it really does help open up everyone's schedules. I think that, before, like, you're totally right. Booking studio time is a pain, and getting people's schedules coordinated is a pain. Like, even if you're doing a one-on-one interview with like a host and one other person, you're still coordinating 3 people's schedules. For one of our original series, the Tech House, scheduling for that series is notoriously a nightmare just because we have our host who's super, super busy. We have, a startup CEO who is super, super busy. And then usually this Fortune 500 exec who is also crazy busy. So it's kind of like just this mashup of like busyness. And I feel like doing remote recordings has kind of eased, not that series because we haven't been recording it, but other series that are similar that we're producing. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I just feel like the digital world I'm glad that we're all starting to kind of integrate. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Embrace it. That's the word.
Yeah, totally. And then sort of the second part there is like sort of the subject matter of all this content. I mean, yeah, I'd love to talk about sort of that consciousness expansion and psychedelics and yoga and meditation, because I think those are things that are like missing right now a lot, especially from the work right now. I think people are starting to embrace it a little bit more now. And in fact, I'm reading a book right now called The Buddha and the Badass. And if you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend checking out. It's from the founder of Mind Valley, Vishen. And the whole idea is like bringing in the Buddha, like sort of like, the spirituality, and the badass, the startup disruptor. And how do you bring those two together into the workspace? And this book is absolutely incredible. And just the way that he fuses the two, that's sort of what I've been reading over the last week and a bit. So highly recommend that. It's like the perfect timing for that. And then as sort of like an add-on to that, he has a course called, I think it's called Be Extraordinary at Work. And it takes all the ideas from the book and he puts it into a course. So I'm kind of going through that course at the same time. And it's amazing. It's really, really cool. But, I think the subject matter of putting that into podcasts is really interesting to me. So like for field tripping, some of these other things, how do you guys go around like sort of the production process of this? Is it you guys coming up with ideas with the team, or is it completely field trip coming up with the ideas and you guys are just producing it for them? Like, how does that really work?
Yeah, so for Field Trip, we really just play the production role. So they actually come up with a lot of the ideas. They source all the guests and do most of the interviews. And then what we do is we will, help them on like transition scripting, and we do like the editing and sound design and distribution for it. So really, like our job essentially is to be on the recordings, listen to the content, and figure out how do we make the content come to life for a listener who can't necessarily see what the speaker is seeing. saying. For example, in episode 4, which is going to drop tomorrow, which is after this podcast, so I can talk about it. It's just like, you're like, wait a minute. Yeah. So in episode 4, it was really interesting. It's my favorite episode. It's with Andrew Weil, who was part of the Harvard Psychedelics Club with Ram Dass. And oh my God, it's incredible. I was fangirling the entire time. And he is an integrative medicine doctor. And he was talking about like his experience in a valley and how he wanted to pet a bumblebee and how he was like super high on, I want to say it was either mushrooms or acid, might've been LSD, can't remember, one of the 3. And he was walking through a canyon and a bumblebee landed on him. And he was like, swore that he like was petting this bumblebee because he thought that he was giving off like a vibe that was welcoming to the bee. And I just think that's so interesting from a sound perspective because, you know, when he's talking about like walking through a canyon and petting a bumblebee, like how do you bring that to life in audio form, right? Because like that's such a visual thing. Like immediately when I'm saying that, like you can kind of picture it, right? Although it is a strange visual. So that's been a bit of a challenge, but also like a really exciting project to work on for that reason. Another example of that was in the first episode with Don Lattin, who actually wrote the Harvard Psychedelics Club. If you haven't read it, it's a cool book. So with Don Lattin, he was talking about, you know, one of his trips, I think it was his first like ayahuasca trip, and he was like going into the jungle. And like, so Britt did this really cool, interesting thing with like the sound design, or it was like the jungle sounds. And you kind of like hear like kind of this like sparkly like music. So you can kind of like feel like, you know, the plants coming alive and stuff as he's talking. So that was really cool.
That's so cool. That's so cool. You guys add the sound effects to it rather than it's just purely an interview, because that can get sort of boring sometimes. I mean, this is going to be like an hour long, you know, interview style chat, which I hope we can keep engaging. But I think adding those extra little elements definitely brings it up to the next level. And I don't know if you saw, I think it was last week, Apple announced that the AirPod Pro will have spatial audio and head tracking. So it'll be really cool to see how you guys incorporate that. You know, as you're moving your head, you can sort of like pin sounds to certain areas. So if you turn your head to the left, you just hear it in the left ear. And then as you move your head, you'll hear it to the right ear. So, I mean, that's stuff we've been doing with VR already, but with 360 video and using VR headsets. But now the fact that, you know, your headphones will be able to track stuff, you'll be able to have this more immersive, like, sound experience. Obviously for people just with AirPod Pros, I guess, for now.
Yeah. I mean, but that's so interesting because Apple is still number 1, right, on all the listening platforms. I do think Spotify is going to surpass them.
Really? What makes you think that?
Because Spotify has been just acquiring people left and right. Like they acquired the Joe Rogan podcast. They now have Kim K. I think I can't remember who else it was. They've been acquiring a bunch of like really popular shows and signing deals with them. They acquired Gimlet. They have Anchor. Like if you think about like what they're building, like first of all, they have a much better analytics platform. They make it so much easier for podcasters to upload their shows, which by nature is going to give you better shows because more people are going to want to put their creative on your platform. So that's number 1. And then number 2, like you're getting all of these exclusive deals with these celebrities that are already so popular. So all of that listener base is now going to come over to Spotify. Like if you think about Joe Rogan, like he mostly started on YouTube. And so they basically took that share of his audience and now have it on Spotify, because I don't think Joe Rogan can broadcast on YouTube now with the deal. So, I mean, it's in some interesting moves that they're making. And honestly, I just believe that Spotify has more of a vision for what podcasting should be in the future. Whereas Apple, I mean, if you look at their analytics platform, if you look at, you know, how the process of distribution on Apple, like it's an absolute nightmare compared to Spotify. Like you upload for Spotify, it's on the platform right away. Apple takes 48 hours. If you have to redirect an RSS feed, Apple takes like 72 hours to a week. Their customer support is terrible. Spotify has a million FAQ and like helpful articles. Apple does not.
Yeah. It's sort of like the app distribution, but, you know, somehow people still default to iOS. Maybe it's a little bit different for apps, but I totally agree for podcasting. And I think for the Joe Rogan deal, Spotify will even be adding video. So I think they're adding that feature purely for Joe. And I'm sure that will, you know, go across the rest of the platform, which is huge.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, like they own Anchor. That's where I host my podcast right now. And they own Soundtrap, where you can create podcasts. So they own the entire chain from creation to distribution. And you can do it in like literally like a weekend. I'm pretty sure I set up my whole podcast like in a weekend, and Spotify was the first platform that accepted it all.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing is I feel like a lot of people when they think about podcasting, they just think that it's like this huge barrier to entry, and it's not the case anymore. Like you said, you can literally set it up in a weekend. You can grab a USB mic as long as you plan it out, like think about who your audiences are, and you can really like you can just record and get it out there. But I have to say though, although it is easy to put a podcast out, like I think you're definitely an exception because you've had a podcast before and you know the media space, but not all podcasts are created equal. And I feel like there is a lot of people out there who will set up their podcast within 48 hours and DIY it and expect an audience right from the get-go. And that's not how it works. Like I always tell like clients as well as, anyone who asks me, I'm like, podcasts are a marathon. They're not a sprint. It takes a lot of hard work, just like any other marketing medium. You need to figure out like, who your audience is, what niche value you're actually bringing to your audience that no other podcast is bringing, just like you would selling a product or a service. And then you need to figure out what distribution channels you're going to use to actually reach that audience and spike those listenerships and like then test it, right? So yeah, that's my rant for the day about podcasting.
It's so true. And I want to go even deeper on that because I totally agree. And I want to, because I know what you guys do. You guys do the marketing side as well. Like you help produce and grow these podcasts. So, this is perfect because I wanted to get this selfishly now for me to help with my podcast, but hopefully for anyone else listening who might podcast. What are some helpful tips on how they can start thinking about these questions that you brought up of, bringing your niche value, setting things up, but then also how do you grow? How do you select the channels? And then how do you actually start growing those numbers? And how do you get loyal followers and listeners?
Yeah. So, well, first things first, I'll start with the beginning of that question, which is essentially like, if you're going to start a podcast, what do I do? Right. And I feel like when people think about starting a podcast, they're like, ooh, I'm really into yoga and I'm going to start a yoga podcast and I'm just going to talk about yoga. And then it ends up being an hour-long rant of you on the mic, maybe with another person. You edit out some of the ums. Sometimes you don't. Usually the audio sounds like shit because you're in a very large space and have no idea about sound control. You put it on the podcast, you get 0 listeners, you put out, 10, 15 episodes, and then you're like, fuck this. I only have 100 listeners. I'm not going to be yoga girl. Okay, that was fun. So, but that's a complete waste of your time. Why would you do that? So, it aggravates me. So the number one thing that you need to think about before even getting to the topic of your podcast is what your goal is. So, okay, cool. You want to start a yoga podcast? That's nice. But what is your goal? Are you trying to gain listeners? Do you have a yoga business? And are you trying to gain leads for that yoga business? Are you trying to bring in sponsorship deals? Are you trying to bring in creative partners? Like, are you just trying to make connections in the yoga world because you're a new instructor and you want to teach at more studios? Like, there's a million different ways that podcasting can be used. That doesn't necessarily come down to how many downloads you have. So that's number one. And then number two, once you kind of figure out what that goal is, then you need to look at the competitive landscape and figure out, okay, like on Apple, who are the top podcasts in my category that are about this particular subject? And what am I not hearing in those podcasts that I can bring to the table? That's my unique perspective that also appeals to a mass audience, if that's your goal, or, the audience that you've chosen, and just try and figure out kind of like, what that unique value is. So that's like 2 basic things right there, I would say. Another thing as well, when you're looking at like these different podcasts, like and doing that competitive analysis, is don't shy away from inspiration, right? So a big thing is if you're listening to a podcast that's really successful, not only take what they don't have, but take what they do have, because success leaves clues. So there's usually a reason why those podcasts are in the top 10. And maybe it's the relatability of the host. Maybe it's the tone they're using. Maybe it's the sound design. Like there's a million reasons why podcasts do really well and engage audiences. So that's another thing, just make lists. And then once you kind of have that sort of figured out, then we can start talking about like, okay, let's design the content of this podcast. Like, what is it going to sound like? What is my roadmap? How am I going to make sure that every episode is consistent but not boring? How am I going to make sure that every topic engages our listeners and actually is something that is very relevant and gives value. So from there, once you kind of have that all like planned out, figure out if you want guests, figure out if you want it to be multi-story, do you want it to just be a narration where you're crying on the mic? I've actually listened to a lot of those and they're great. So whatever you want. And then, you can record it. And obviously I think sound quality is key because there's literally over 1 million podcasts now. We surpassed 1 million with the COVID outbreak because everyone wanted to start a podcast.
Yeah, I think more people were recording podcasts than listening to them over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was really funny because listenership actually went down during COVID because people weren't commuting as much. But the people who bought mics and started podcasts skyrocketed, which was like kind of a weird juxtaposition if you think about it. But
it's interesting.
Right.
Yeah, it's more of like a hobby thing more than anything. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think when we go back to normal, we're going to see it kind of like the inactive podcasts start to increase again, but we'll see what happens.
But it's cool. It's cool to me. What's cool is like they exist and they will stay there. I mean, unless they're using a paid hosting platform, then it will just die out. But if they're using like Anchor or something, the episodes that they recorded are out there and they just live out on the internet and you can access them and you can maybe find them. So like even for me, Think Tank, our first podcast, we also put the episodes up on YouTube. And we canned it just because my co-host, and that's another thing, it's a lot easier to do these things without a co-host because you don't have to like schedule stuff, but he didn't want to continue the podcast. And so we kind of like canned the whole show. And then a year later, which was like maybe 3 weeks ago, I started looking back on our YouTube page. I'm like, oh, let's just see if like how many listens we had. We had episodes with like 100,000 views and like 60,000 views because it was like over time, right? You said it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
And then I'm looking at all these comments and they're like, oh, this was such an awesome podcast. What happened to them? Why did they just stop after this one? So I was like, holy shit, like if you just kept going, it could have been huge. So that was kind of my lesson learned for bringing that into this podcast. So it's, again, like exactly like you said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But then like, okay, let's just say this. You've created the episodes. You have like 10 episodes, 20 episodes. How do you start growing your listenership now? How do you start getting people start listening to them? How do you get people to find you even?
Yeah, see, that's a tough question and it's different for every podcast. So if you're trying to grow your audience, the biggest thing is looking at who your target is and where they live. So for example, if you have like, I'll use that yoga podcast again. Think about the groups in which they live. Like, where do they go on social media? Who are those influencers? And also think about in audio platforms. A lot of people don't think about this when they think about promoting their podcast. A lot of people are like, okay, I have a podcast. I'll put it on Instagram. I'll put it on YouTube. Like maybe I'll run some like Facebook ads or something like that. We'll try and, boost the audience that way. But what people are missing is that that's actually not a podcast platform. Social platforms, people are scrolling and they're just chilling and they're like, usually doing kind of quick hit content, right? Mm-hmm. Podcast is long form. So what you need to do is you need to target people who are already actively listening to podcasts. So the biggest thing that I can advise for people to try and grow their audiences is get guest slots on other podcasts that are similar or have similar audiences. You can do that by inviting their host to come on your show, and then hopefully you get invited back, or you can just request to be a guest if you're like a cool human, which I'm sure most people listening are. So you can do that. And then also you can do in-podcast ads. So you can do that via Spotify Ad Studio if you want to pay for it. That actually works really well. It's $250 USD minimum, just heads up. But you can go in and target like people who are interested in podcasts in the different categories that are listening. And then Spotify's user base is actually about 50 paid, 50% unpaid. So all those unpaid users can then listen to your ad and then are likely to subscribe or follow, maybe not listen right away, but probably follow and click through into Spotify. Another thing that Spotify does really well is you can do linking on Spotify. So if you have your Spotify link to the show, it doesn't take you off of the platform, right? So it's really, really easy for people who are maybe listening to a playlist to click on your podcast, get to the page, press the follow button and save it for later, right? So that's a really interesting way of growing your audience as well. And then obviously you can also do like in podcast ads, as in like traditionally where you contact, the host of a larger show and you ask, hey, how much is it going to be for me to like put an ad slot on your podcast? Or can I rent the RSS feed of your podcast? How much would that be? And you pay them to, either like put in a slot where they're like, hey, like this is really cool and you all should check this out. Or renting RSS feeds, like I just mentioned, is actually a really interesting way as well, where the host kind of does an intro and it's like, so today we're going to be doing a really cool bonus episode where we're going to actually be featuring Meld, and I really hope you enjoy it. Here's Josh. And then they play your episode because that RSS feed already has a dedicated X amount of subscribers. So you're getting in front of all of those people, right? So those are a couple of different ways that I feel are the most effective. And another thing as well is your social channels, although generally don't correlate directly into listener retention, it is important to build them organically, because people who are seeing your show, the more that they see it and the more it's top of mind, the more likely they are to search it and actually look at it, right? So, build your following. Also, press is really important as well. Like, try your best to get on like Pod News, try your best to get on all of these different platforms where there's like reviews, like Podchaser, or Quill actually has a really good podcast review platform as well, because people are actively looking for podcasts to listen to. And where do they generally go? They're going to go to reviews to see what other people are listening to. So those are most of my suggestions, I would say. It's like a lot. So
yeah, it's a lot that I haven't even thought of, because I did this sort of traditional thing where I do this every episode, and I will continue to do this, where I do post on my social media, and I'll take my favorite 1-minute clip from the episode and turn it into a short video. And I interviewed this guy named Michael Aubrey, who created an app called Story Creator exactly for this. It's sort of like Headliner, which is another big app for this. But you can put in your thumbnail, you can put in the audio, and then it will generate waveforms that correlate to the audio. And then you can do sort of like transcription, so people can kind of read. Because like you said, most people on social media are scrolling. They want to quickly read and then go next. But if we kind of mix this idea of me posting this every week with the idea that this is a marathon, it correlates exactly what you said. Keep it top of mind. People, maybe they see it like 5, 10 episodes, maybe 15 episodes on my feed. They're like, fuck this guy, stop posting your stupid podcast. I don't care. But then like something hits and like, oh, this is actually kind of awesome. Steph is talking about psychedelics. I want to learn about psychedelics. I want to hear about people tripping out. So like, I think for me, it's sort of like that. I'm not really focused too much on a specific niche or anything. It's like, who are the coolest people that I know, and how can I use that to leverage just like really cool stories and ideas and put it all into one place. I don't want to just talk about one thing, for me anyways. But I could see there almost being like a podcast network where you're like, hey, this is like, which is sort of what you guys are doing. You're like, hey, well, we can have a client that has a podcast specifically about psychedelics, one specifically about tech, one about banking. Then you can put these all together into a network, and now you can talk about all these things, but each podcast is about something specific, where I guess I'm doing almost the opposite. I'm just kind of doing everything, sort of, still within the realm of business, technology, and interesting stuff, really. I'm not going to talk about certain things. There's certain things I won't talk about. I won't mention them here because I won't talk about them. And now you're all thinking, what the fuck is that? You'll never know because I won't talk about it. That's now. I'm like, what? You'll never know because I won't talk about it.
All right.
We're not getting there.
No, we're not going there. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And I think like what you guys are doing is really, really cool, because you guys are clearly masterminds of podcasting. I know you guys didn't start that way, right? You guys did something completely different. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that? I know, but my listeners might not know.
Let me retell the story to you. Oh my God. Yeah. So OMH started so weirdly. I always tell everyone that we backdoored into the business because it just made no sense. And I look back at our journey and it's like, what were we doing? Like on so many levels, I'm like, oh my God. Like I look back and when you think about like cringy moments, you're just kind of like, ugh. Like it was like, it's whole thing. Like the past, like if I look back about 4 years ago, I'm just like, oh my God. So basically what we did was we actually started off as an online magazine where we interviewed entrepreneurs about how they started their own businesses. I had always wanted to be an entrepreneur when I was younger. Going through high school, my dad basically shoved Robert Kiyosaki's book into my brain and was like, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, you need to read this. You will be an entrepreneur. And I was like, Okay. So I was lucky enough that I watched him build a couple of businesses while I was younger. And so I was kind of very inspired by that. And I just wanted to take the leap myself eventually. Did I think I was going to do that in my first year of university? No, but that's life happens. So I walked into my first year of business class, and the first thing that they said was that 95% of startups fail. And so I was like, good. Great, on a good path here. I was notoriously a perfectionist, which a lot of people are surprised about in high school. Like, I was actually a very academic kid and very focused on school, which is not something you will hear from me today. But I was really curious about, how do I not fail? How do I become that 5% that succeeds? So what I decided to do was start interviewing entrepreneurs about how they became successful. And what that turned into was I realized that there was this common correlation amongst entrepreneurial stories that is like the grit and the hard aspect of entrepreneurship that nobody freaking talks about. Like the points where like you feel like you're going to break, the points where, you maybe weren't able to pay rent for a couple months before your business took off. And, everyone looks at this like overnight success or, that point where they took off and they're like, oh, wow, like you're Jeff Bezos or you're Elon Musk. And I'm like, yeah, but like who were they before they were them? You know what I mean? It's like, that's the important part because that's what made them who they are today. And that's the stepping stones in which, they live their lives by and were able to become successful. Like I kind of look at life as, you're always just like stepping, and every point of life is like a new level that you just need to like ground yourself with and figure out before you can actually get to the next step is, how I think about it. And so that's what we started doing was we interviewed these entrepreneurs. We did over 100 interviews. Britt came on my team very early on doing like video and photo work because I hate doing it and I'm terrible. And I realized early on that I also hated writing. So I built a team of volunteers basically to essentially do the work for me. And
now that's entrepreneurship. That is the definition of entrepreneurship right there.
Literally.
If anyone needed a definition.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, nope, I'm over this. So I built the team of volunteers, and then we started to get work underneath it. So I was kind of in my second year of university, and people we would meet while we were interviewing were like, oh, so we really liked the interview. Like, would you be willing to write blogs for us? Would you guys be willing to do videos for us? Would you do a podcast for us? Would you build a website? And me being stupid, young, and naive was like, absolutely, I will do everything. And I'm like, I'm going to make all this money. And I had no idea what I was doing. And long story short, the first agency that we tried to build failed miserably. It was a dark time. Not going to get into that. But then we switched back and fully continued doing the magazine and eventually came to the conclusion that we all hated it. Ali came on early on as well. And I remember having that conversation, like we sat down. It was funny because we had gotten into the transmedia zone as Origins Magazine. And I remember Kate kept kind of nudging us. Like we would go into her office. And for listeners who don't know who Kate is, because I just realized we're talking to many people, not just each other. But for listeners who don't know who Kate is, she is an incredible woman who we all love and builds businesses. And she's a complete badass. And she really pushed our company. And I still actually attribute a lot of like our early success to her because she was the one who would like give us the tough love that we needed early on. And I remember sitting in her office and she was like, you guys really need to think about what makes the magazine different. Like, I don't really see, that you guys are doing anything that's different than like other people who are just interviewing entrepreneurs. You need to pick a niche. And I remember we all sat down after that meeting and we're like, we hate this magazine. We all hate our lives. We hate telling the same story over and over again. And this is not fueling us. It is hindering us. And so we were like, how can we fix that? And at the time, I was also working another job. I was heading up marketing at a tech startup called Chatter Research, which is a retail tech AI company. And I remember I was traveling to all these different conferences and it was ridiculous. It was like once or twice a month and then trying to run this business. And I just remember during these conferences, like we were targeting a very specific type of executive. It was generally like consumer insights. And I remember literally running around the damn conference, like memorizing people's outfits that I knew were from select companies that I wanted to land, sitting beside them on purpose at tables, trying to like basically stalk them into coming to our booth, and then eventually trying to land deals. And we were lucky enough that like we did generate a lot of revenue. We landed a lot of deals from those conferences, which is good for me anyways in my ROI report. But I was like, there has got to be a better way to do this, because I was frustrated because it felt inauthentic, because that's not the kind of person I am. I don't want to be sleazy and like be sitting by the registration desk and figuring out who the consumer insights person is from Canadian Tire so I can sit beside them in the conference pretending that I have no idea who you are and then pitch my idea casually. Like, no, it's just really awkward, right?
Yeah.
So that's when the idea for the tech house came. Was we thought that what if we put, this Fortune 500 executive with a startup in a podcast scenario where it's completely organic and they can have a 40-minute conversation about how technology is changing our world, aka how the startup can change the executive's life. So it was actually a marketing play to start with. And I remember we pitched that to Kate and she was really into it. So we actually ended up pivoting the entire company around that idea from the magazine. So we went hard into the tech house, tried to get season 1 rolling. We ended up landing a really amazing host, Swish, who is still our host today. And as we were doing that, people started to ask us like, oh, like, do you guys do podcasts now? Like, would you be willing to do our podcast? And then we started to see that there was an opportunity for brands. And I've always found that audio is a really interesting way to build relationships with customers, specifically for brands, because in the way that you build a relationship with the host, it's like, you feel like they're your friend, it's like you have them in your ear, you trust what they're saying. So for brands, it's really an interesting way for you to connect directly to your consumer in an organic way that, fosters both your and your customers' values, right? And if you look at millennial shopping habits, that's the number one thing as to why they buy your products. So yeah, so that's kind of how we pivoted. And really, that's the philosophy that our agency has had ever since. And we've had lots of success, luckily.
That's awesome. And I could definitely see you guys continuing to evolve and grow as things grow and change, because it seems like that's kind of what you guys have been doing. And I think you have to just continually grow and continually change and never kind of like rest on your laurels. It's sort of like, hey, we do this thing. Let's keep doing that well. Okay, what else can we keep doing? It's sort of just like thinking about the future. But what I really love about your journey and like your story is like, you always connected it back to your values. Like, you're like, I don't want to do this shit that makes me feel inauthentic. Fuck that. Like, you could feel it. Like, I feel like I'm wearing a mask and I'm lying to you. You want something authentic, and podcasting is a very authentic, I think, medium. Most of the time, I would say, like, it's quite authentic, especially after an hour. After about 20 minutes, like, the shit we're talking about it's got to be real. Like, we're gonna run out of shit to talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. and then just going back to like sort of the clients you guys are working with and the type of stuff you're working on now, you're attracting the right clients. It's not just like randomness. It's like clearly you're into like transcendental experiences. So you guys have connected with, with field trips. You guys are creating content for them. And it seems really cool that you're able to bring in your values. And I guess my question now is like, have you guys gone through a sort of like value or mission statement sort of thing as a team and as like a personal founder? Because again, I'm going to bring back the book I've been reading, Buddha and the Badass, and it's super important because like we did that from day one at our company, Controverse. But have you guys done that? Have you thought about, okay, what are our values? What do we want to do? What kind of impact we want to make? And then do you incorporate that into your business right now?
Oh, we do. Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that I've always brought with me in terms of running a company is culture. I hold that very dear because I've had so many experiences with, bosses ever since I was young that really fostered like a level of anxiety in me as an employee, which is why I don't like working for people. I remember when I was 14, I started working at Tim Hortons and they were horrible and the bosses just kind of held things over your head. And yes, to an extent, that's probably like the fast food experience for most people, but it doesn't have to be. And I don't understand why there's so many managers and so many bosses out there that foster this toxic culture where it's like, I say you do, and it shouldn't be that like that. It should be, a sharing of ideas. It should feel like you are contributing to something because that's what work is. And that's what work should be, is it should make you happy. And it should be something that like you feel like you're contributing to the world in some way or another. Like, what are you going to leave behind? It's probably going to be from your work, because that's the majority of what you're going to be doing for your life. Like, 40 hours a week. I mean,
yeah, or more. Usually more. Yeah.
Usually more. Yeah. Especially for us.
Yeah. Especially if you're running the company. And I know you were just saying like you worked in tech, and, I'm a huge, advocate for diversity. Marissa and I were both co-founders. There's male, female kind of relationship there. So by default, we're not fucking, we're not this toxic masculinity sort of face that technology as a whole has been putting on. But I know you said that you had some stories. Are you okay with talking about some of them and sort of how that has shaped how you think right now and how you run your company?
Oh, absolutely. For sure. It's funny because people always ask us, they're like, oh, wow, you're a woman-led startup. And I think all three of us will tell you, it's like, well, we don't really see it any different than any other startup. We happen to be females and we run a company together, and we're luckily very close friends. Like, that's pretty much all it is. But absolutely, I think taking it out of the shallow like joke of it all, I think there is definitely some things that have happened to all three of us that we want to make sure never happens in our company ever. There have been some very derogatory remarks that have been made to myself, to Allie, to Britt. Like, we've not been taken seriously our entire careers because we're young, and the amount of times I've walked into a boardroom and essentially almost been laughed at or not taken seriously because I'm too young and naive and she clearly has no idea what she's talking about is ridiculous. And so I think what you need to do is you just really need to have your facts straight, and you always need to present yourself in the most professional light possible, because no one can dispute that you know your shit when you know your shit. So that's pretty much where I come from. When I was working in tech, I mean, for the most part, I did have a great experience. I was lucky enough to work for some really cool companies. And I remember in my one internship that I worked at, it was a great experience overall. Like, I learned so much. And for the most part, the majority of my colleagues were really great. And then there was this one scenario where I was left alone in the office once, which is fine. I should be able to be left alone. I was like, I don't know, 20 years old, I think at the time. And I was just like working away in one of the boardrooms, and this guy came in, and he was kind of like an older guy. He didn't work in our department. And I remember I'd maybe talked to him twice, and he was like, you just give me this vibe. And I'm like, okay. I was like, what vibe? And like, me being a friendly, generally a pretty quirky person, I'm like, haha, what vibe? Like, trying to make fun of it. So I'm just like, I don't know how to react to this. It's weird. And then he like kind of like stands in the doorway and kind of like puts his hand on the doorway. It's like, yeah, like, I just was wondering, I really feel like, you're this like really cool person, and I got this really great vibe. And, like, I was a life coach, and I just feel like you and I would make a really good match. And I'm like, I was like, I was like, no. And at that point, I'm like, this is uncomfortable. And I'm like, you're standing in the doorway with your arm up. So that immediately tells me body language wise that I can't get out of this situation. So I'm like, okay. And in my head, I'm like, all right, Steph, what are you going to do here? And so I'm just like sitting there, and I like close my laptop, and I'm like, okay. And he was like, yeah, so, I was just wondering, like, if you feel something. And I was like, I don't. I really don't. I was like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't. I feel nothing. Like, I'm an intern. I just work here. Like, I don't really know you very well. And I was like, that's interesting that you're a life coach. And I tried to like just kind of casually mold the conversation in a different direction. And then eventually he kind of like got the hint, and like luckily like walked away, and it wasn't anything like traumatic.
Okay, good.
But yeah. It was a scary like scenario for someone who's young, and like you're the only person in the office. You don't know what's going to happen. And so I was like, all right. So I think I dealt with it well enough that he kind of knew like, no, like get out sort of deal, which was good. But still, it's like that shouldn't happen. Like, you know what I mean? And this guy was probably like in his late 40s, and I was 20. Like, yeah,
that's not cool.
And it's kind of like a power play. So I'm like, no, thank you. At my other job, as much as I love all of these people that were actually at this other job, I love all of them. I was in an all male team. I was the fourth hire, and I genuinely did love my time at that startup. And we were all really good friends. And they used to make this joke which like I played along with. Like it wasn't funny, but I played along with it because it was so uncomfortable. But they were like, they're like, yeah, for lunch, like we should go to the strip club. And I'm like,
Yeah.
Like, how about we not go to the strip club?
That's when you say, yeah, we should go to the strip club. Remington's. You guys like the male strip club, right? That's what you do. You have to just lean into it.
Oh, and I did. I was like, yeah, anytime, anywhere, let's go. Like, that's what I used to say. And I just would pretend that it was fine. And they were always like,
right.
I could tell when they would say it, they would all look over at me to see like what my reaction was going to be. And if I was going to play along or like, oh, is she going to say something about it kind of thing? Like, can we push her buttons or whatever? Yeah. And part of it's like funny. I'm like, okay, whatever. Like, I know they didn't mean anything by it, like whatever. And they weren't thinking about it. And I know like none of these guys, like I'm actually friends with all of them today. I love all of them. And I know they didn't mean it in the way that it was coming off, but I always use this story as a precautionary tale because I'm like, even if you're joking, think about the joke and think about who is the joke in that scenario, because the joke isn't the strip club. The joke was me. Mm-hmm. So, and the joke was the fact that I am a woman and how is me being a woman going to react to this situation in an all male environment? Like, haha, like, you know what I mean? So that's fine. Like it was great. And I think it did just make me a stronger human being at the end of the day. But like, carrying that into my company now, it's like, I want to make sure that everyone's voice is appreciated. And I make sure that when we bring people onto the team, they know that right from the bat. It's like, your voice is always heard. You can talk to us about anything, open communication. I don't care if like it's unfiltered or you feel like it's unprofessional. Like I would rather you get it out and tell us. Because there are certain things that I think just need to be talked about. And I wish that in certain situations, I would have had the courage to say like, this is not okay. This is bullshit. Like this should not be happening. So, and neither of those scenarios, I said anything. So,
or you laugh it off because that's sort of like when you're uncomfortable, that's just sort of your default. And I know that happens a lot. People are like, but it's like, it's really, really important to not laugh and to literally, exactly you said, turn it around, bring the serious to it and be like, no, that's not okay. And then they'll immediately be like, oh, whoa. Because if you're laughing and they're like, oh, it's a joke, and they keep going with it. Same thing where like if a dog's I learned this because like, we're training a puppy right now. And if your dog's barking at you and you're saying, hey, stop, and you're yelling at it, it's going to keep barking because it thinks that you're barking back at it and you're going to keep going in a cycle. So same thing with these toxic moments. You have to literally turn it around and do the opposite of what they want. They want to laugh. They want you to feel like sort of uncomfortable, like, and like kind of like laugh towards it. You have to like literally turn it around. You have to turn that situation right around. And I'm glad that you figured that. I mean, sometimes it takes these painful moments to figure that out, but you need those moments now because now you'll make sure it never happens in your culture. Yeah, exactly. Well, if someone ever did any of those two things that I just suggested, they'd be fired on the spot.
Oh, like, hands down. Like, that's it. So, I mean, you would be gone. And, there's so many things, though, that also can make a company culture toxic. I mean, like, like the male-female dynamic aside, like, there's also been so many scenarios where, I've had other females that haven't been the most welcoming either. And I think, there's a whole level of, people need to realize that you need to check your ego at the door. That's another thing that I've noticed. And this can be, if you're working on a team, if you're working with other agencies, I think one of the biggest thing that people like about working with us at OMH is that we don't have an ego when we walk in. Like we know what we're talking about and we'll give you the facts, but we're not here to like say we're better than you. We're not here to talk about how much we know about podcasts. Like we're here to collaborate with you. We're here to make the best product possible. And, I think all of our partners that we work with, like they know that. It's like, we're here to support you. We want to elevate you and we want to elevate the podcast category as a whole. And we don't want to do that by, bringing someone else down, because why would you do that? That's not fostering a culture of creativity. That's not going to make the product any better at the end of the day. That's going to make it worse. So I don't know why people are like that. It aggravates me.
And that's just surface level too. And if you go a little bit deeper, it's like that's how people are as a whole, as a human. And obviously you're into yoga culture and sort of this Zen culture, and it's great that you can bring that into it and bring it into tech, bring it to podcasting, because some people, they don't really understand that any of that exists, and they're sort of at this like this really weird shallow depth in reality where they don't, you can tell they have no idea. They're maybe an atheist even, like they just don't give a shit. They're really on this like physical plane of like, I want to make money, fuck you, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to put you down, I'm going to put myself ahead of everyone else. Whereas like you have to do almost the opposite. It's like not even check your ego at the door. You have to put other people almost ahead of you and think of like, I always call it the infinite game. It's not just like I win, you lose. It's like, how do we both win and then raise the whole category, raise everything up? And I think like people need to learn how to do that. And I don't know how, like, how did you learn how to do that? Was it through yoga? Was it through meditation, or was it something before that? Did you have some like an awakening moment, or like, walk me through that?
I don't know. It's like, it's funny because something that people always have said to me, which I've always found kind of strange, is they're like, oh, like have some confidence. And it's like, honestly, it's like I have confidence half the time. I'm either making fun of myself to make sure that you feel that you are a little higher so you get your ideas across, or it's that like I want everyone to feel comfortable. Like, I don't know. I think it's just something that I've kind of always had inside of me. Like, even when you're in high school and you go to parties and like you and you're like, I mean, actually, no, I'm going to not say that. But when you're in high school and you go to parties and there's always like those 2 or 3 people who are in the corner by themselves and they're clearly like not having the best time. I always just kind of relate to those people. Although I'm generally not the person in the corner, I feel for them. And I've always been the type of person to go to the corner and make sure that they feel included. Like, I just feel like they have to be, because no one wants to be the kid that's left out, and I think that's just human nature, is everyone relates better to each other when they feel like they're a part of a community and they feel like they're comfortable. So that's a really big thing that I've always kind of brought with me, is like, even when I'm at networking events, like the number one networking tip that I've always held is always look at the person who's standing by themselves by the door, or go around and like the person who's like by themselves eating at the table, like go and talk to them because they don't have anyone to talk to. Like, don't go to these big groups with all these people, because it's awkward, and why would you go to a group when they already have people? Like, go and grab some people on the side, find your own tribe, and then merge into other tribes, like that's kind of what I've always like learned to do. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it has a lot to do with my yoga and meditation practice.
I'm sure it helps in the day-to-day sort of mindset to keep you nice and open and zen, but
yeah, I mean, I do yoga to keep myself sane, really. But I think the biggest thing yoga's helped me with, though, is balance. Like 100%.
Like physical balance?
Yes. Yeah, and mental
both.
balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know if you practice Yin Yoga at all?
Not Yin Yoga. My mom is actually a yoga instructor. So anytime I'm at her cottage or at her place, actually, for a long time, every single Wednesday, she did a class back in my hometown, and I would always do it with her. And she taught like flow. I can't remember the exact name, but it was a type of flow yoga.
Nice.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah, go on. I have not done that one.
Love flow yoga. I get what you mean. I don't know like exactly the type, but I totally get you. That's generally what I practice as well. Although Yin has changed my life. I love Yin. It's slower. So Yin practice is generally you're holding a pose for like anywhere from like sometimes 1 minute if you're like on the like beginner end, or sometimes up to like 5 or 6 minutes. And the idea is to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation and find your edge and find the place that you can push yourself forward, but not so much that you're falling off the edge and actually like physically hurting yourself.
Okay, I have tried that, and I have to pause you here because I have done that, and my mom did teach this class, except the time she did that, I technically accidentally took a double dose of edibles before. And I can tell you, I went way past that edge without even knowing it. My mom came by. She's like, what are you doing? My leg was like wrapped all the way around. I'm like, holy shit. I couldn't feel it at the time. But then after looking at it, I was like, holy shit. And my leg was literally just bent way further than it should have. Luckily, it didn't hurt, but I was like, oh my God. So I guess don't take too much edibles before doing this yoga. But I digress. Just keep going. I love it. I love it.
I love that story. Honestly, getting high and doing yoga is like my favorite thing in the world. So I relate to that so much. But
it is the best. But
it feels going amazing.
Past, it does. It does. And again, you can guys go way past your edge and not really feel a thing. But I know exactly what you mean about feeling that edge and then not going past it, finding it and really feeling it.
Exactly, right? And so what I've always found interesting about that philosophy is if you take that off of the mat and you think about that in your everyday life, it's all about uncomfortable situations. So how do you put yourself in an uncomfortable spot, so you're like fearful and you're pushing yourself forward, whether that's in your business, whether that's in your relationships, whether it's, you know, in your life or your routines. But how do you not go so far that you're burning out and that you're falling off the edge and your mental health is being affected, or your physical health? Are you eating properly? Like, there's a lot of things that you need to check in and understand. And I've been lucky enough that, like, I think through the first agency and like the magazine failing, like I was on the brink of burnout. I was not doing well. And I found a lot of triggers within myself. Like, first off, I know that, and this makes me sound like a crazy plant lady, I know, but like I have a ton of plants, and when they're not watered and they're not doing well, it's a reflection of my mental state. And I know that because if they're not being watered and I'm not taking care of my plants, which is something that I care about because I like having I'm going to sound like
no, totally. No, it totally makes sense. This is perfect. I love this.
Yeah, but I like having, you know, pieces of like the earth with me in my apartment. So if they're not doing well, then I know that I'm not doing well because I'm not making time for myself by not watering my plants. And that's not okay, right? And if I'm not eating properly, that's another big thing. Like if I am eating a lot of takeout, or if I'm not eating in general, which has happened before as well, I know that that is like a telltale sign that I am about to burn out, and that's not good. Like, you need to take a couple days off and get your shit together. Or if I don't do my morning routine, like if I don't get up and make my bed, that's another thing that like I know triggers me. So yeah, I think it's just about like exploring that within yourself and finding those edge points, and then knowing those signals of, you know, when you're falling off, and then learning to just, you know, learning to how to counterbalance that. You know, for me, it's like, I know that when like things are like hitting the fan, the plants aren't getting watered, my laundry's everywhere, like I'm not doing well. I know that I need to take a day off, I need to take a breath, I need to walk around, I need to listen to an audiobook, go for a bike ride, whatever it is, and get my shit together. And then I'm usually fine. But
totally. Exactly. It's those patterns of existence. You know, it's like you're going to have ups and downs, and you really want to catch those downs and feed the ups, right? It's like a waveform pattern, if you can think about it that way.
Yeah.
You really want to, and it's really cool. Everyone has their own thing. So that's part of this podcast, is finding these tools. And I love that with the plants. Like I have a few plants here, a few more over here off screen. I'm going to get a lot more. I'm currently just in a spare bedroom at Marissa's parents' house right now. We moved out of the condo during COVID because her and I are both super paranoid, and we had someone in our condo that actually had COVID. So we're like, let's just not, because you have to think about it when you're pressing buttons to go up, you know? So we're like, let's just get out of there. But we had so many plants there, and I totally agree. First of all, you need to have plants if you're living in the city. Otherwise, you feel like you're living in a fucking simulation in the city. You need to have plants. And I love that tool of like using the watering of the plants. You know, if the plant's withering, that's like a physical, like you can physically see, oh shit, you know, the plants aren't getting watered. Do you use like an app, like any reminders for that? Or is it purely like, you know, I'm going to like literally just focus on the plants, and if they look kind of fucked up, I'm probably fucked up? Or do you use like an app or reminder or anything like that?
I mean, honestly, this is probably going to sound a little nuts, but like I used to do it every Sunday, and now I just kind of look at the plant, and if it looks like it needs to get watered, then I water it. And like there's a couple of telltale signs, like depending on what plant it is, like, you know, if the soil is dry, or if like I can tell by the color of most of my plants because I've had them for a while, like if they need it. So I just kind of am conscious of it. Like when I take breaks from work, I usually walk around and I stare at my plants and figure out who needs to get watered. Like it's pretty ridiculous, but
that's cool. Do you take that practice in as a leader with like your team? Like, do you like honestly, like seriously, sometimes you'll see like in a meeting, someone's a little bit quieter than normal, or they don't show up on time. Like, hey, I think, people like plants, they need water, they need like sort of that love and encouragement. So do you think of that like with people? Do you ever see telltale signs of like your team members kind of burning out as well?
I love the analogy that you just tied between plants and people, because I do that. And I didn't realize that I did that until you just said it. That's actually really interesting to me. It's like, yes, that's a correlation. I do. I always notice that with team members, if they're being quiet, or if like I find that maybe their work isn't up to par, if they're late on deadlines, that kind of stuff. And I think I'm pretty notorious for calling people out in meetings and being like, hey, you haven't said anything, what's going on, kind of thing. But that also doesn't always work. It's maybe not the best practice to call people out. So sometimes it is about like just taking them aside and having a one-on-one and being like, hey, like, are you okay? How are you doing? And there's been a couple, times where we've had people on our team who aren't doing okay. And we knew that. And we were lucky enough that we pulled them aside early enough to figure out what was going on. And they're like, look, I'm burnt out. Like, I feel like this is too much. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And, so you just need to adapt accordingly to that and figure out how you can help them. Right. Because like at the end of the day, someone's mental health is so much more important than the deadline that you're trying to hit.
Yeah.
Because like what's going to matter, right?
It's all made up anyways.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like we've had a few issues with that with some interns where like we interviewed them and they got through the interview and they're like the most cheery person ever. Like they were so awesome. Like, holy shit. Like this person will brighten up our entire team. I'll bring you on literally just for that. You're also a great designer, but like, this is awesome. And then like the next week they came in and they looked like they were a plant that hadn't been watered for like a month, like completely drooled over. They were not doing any of their work. They were like about to break down and cry during some meetings. So we're like, immediately, we're like, you know what? Like, you take some time off, whatever you need to. Like, if we can help you anyway, let us know. If not, just stop. Like, take what you're doing here off your plate and figure out your own personal stuff, because clearly you need to work on that. And I think that's important. You have to think of people as people, and their mental health comes first and the community comes first. Because if you don't honor that, then it's going to be like a cancer that spreads throughout the entire team. Not only will their sort of like low energy reverberate, but then your energy of like, that doesn't matter also reverberates. And people are like, oh shit, no one really cares about how I feel. And I think like the workplace of the future, especially with the remote, is going to rely heavily on this, on how do you foster community? Because especially with the remote over the last couple months, no one has been doing group activities really. No one has been going to even church. If you go to church, you're not doing your normal group classes that you would normally have as community. So the only community people have had over the last couple months is through work. Work has been their community. It's been everything. So it's really, really important that this gets addressed now, and hopefully some of these incumbent corporations, like, the big banks, the big social media companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, I really hope that they embrace this as much as smaller companies do. But I'm glad that new companies and startups are embracing it now, so that the next generation of the workplace has this as sort of a foundation.
Yeah. And I think that's what was missing. When our parents were creating businesses or working, I think that it was very like bureaucratic kind of culture and like hierarchical. And did I say that right? Is that how you say
hierarchical?
it? Hierarchical.
It's a weird word to nail down.
Hierarchical? I don't know. Whatever that is. That word, the triangle thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I think that's kind of how our parents operated. And it's funny because everyone's like, oh, millennials are entitled. It's like Gen Z is entitled, whatever. And it's like, yeah, we fucking are entitled, and we are entitled to our mental health. Absolutely. And that is what the next wave of work should be, because work should mean something to people, because that is how you get the best work out of people. That's how people enjoy themselves. And I feel like people need to realize, like, how do you like take what's going on inside of you and like funnel that into good work? And also in terms of culture, it's, if you have a toxic culture and you don't give a shit about your like team's mental health, people can feel that. People know that. And honestly, the biggest retention factor that anyone will tell you is generally culture in the team that they're on. If they really like the people, they're going to be more likely to stay there longer because it's fun. It's interesting. They like the work that they're getting to work on, right? In an ideal world. So yeah, I think that's like, it's going to be a really big thing to figure out, especially with COVID. I think finding the communities in a digital world is going to be really interesting and kind of hard. But at the same time, I think there's ways to do it. We just have to figure it out. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we'll probably have a pretty good idea in the next like year or so.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm very grateful that we have these technologies, at the very basic level of Facebook and Twitter, and maybe not so much LinkedIn for this kind of stuff, but like, we have like Reddit. Like you can find a group for whatever it is that you're interested in. Like Marissa, when we got this puppy, she joined like 4 different dog and puppy groups, and then she found her tribe on Instagram, which was all these other Dachshunds. So we got a wiener dog. We have Dachshund owners.
So cute.
You can follow our dog, Tino the Teeny Weenie. I think it's Tino _ the Teeny Weenie.
Oh my
Highly
God,
recommend
so
it. You get daily dose of cute. But through this, like Marissa found her tribe of all these other people who own these dogs and like love for them. So we're starting, I'll put this out on the podcast, I guess, whatever. We are going to be starting a sort of small brand around that. I don't want to say too much about it, but it's going to be awesome.
Oh my gosh, that's so adorable. I love that.
Wait till you get a hold of like the name and the branding and stuff. It's awesome. It's going to be awesome. We're really leaning into the whole wiener thing. It's going to be hilarious. We love it. I love this dog, and we're probably going to get more. Most people who have these Dachshunds have like a bunch of them, so that's awesome. Oh my
gosh, that's adorable.
Yeah, so cute. But I'm so grateful for that we do have the technology, because if we were in this kind of quarantine without technology that can connect us, this would have been a really shitty existence. Remote work wouldn't really be possible, and you wouldn't be able to find your tribe online through Reddit groups or whatever it is. So I highly encourage people, if you're feeling kind of like lonely, just search whatever it is that you're interested in. Like it could be something as simple as plant people. I don't know. There's probably a Facebook group for plant people who love their plants. There's gardening Toronto groups, and you can find people in your local area. So I love that. And I really love that idea of people finding their tribes. And I think that will only get better over time.
Definitely.
So I'm super excited for that. And before we go, because I know it's been just over an hour now, one last question I want to ask you. You can get as deep as you want. What is something that you're very excited about over the next little while? Could have to do with work, with podcasting, with anything. Like, what is something you're super excited about that you think will have a huge impact over the next maybe year or 5 years?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's such a hard question to answer. Okay, something that I've always been actually really interested in is the intersection between podcasting and voice technology. So I'm very curious over the next few years, like as we start introducing this like voice AI kind of in our homes and these like IoT technologies, I'm curious how that can get integrated into podcasts. I'm curious to see if maybe we're going to see AI hosts in the future, because you could technically automate the process. AIs aren't going to stutter. They're not going to say, right? And if that's going to be able to build the same authentic relationship that we are able to do right now, human to human. So I think that I'm really interested in, just like from an industry perspective. I think we're very far off from that, but I'm definitely curious, and I could see that potentially becoming something of the future when it comes to like news or something like that kind of stuff, or information, like spreading, information.
That sounds it sounds a little dystopian to me. What I would really love to see is use that technology. I think you're on the right track. I'd love to see that AI technology be used in the editing process. Because like you said, you brought in an editor. And I know my biggest part of the editing process is, how do I remove any overlaps? Like luckily we're recording on separate channels. Then how do I record any ohs, and these like little spaces? And I know on the Google Podcast app, this is why it's my favorite podcast app. I love Spotify, I love Apple, but Google Podcast is my favorite because there's a setting on it where you can get rid of basically any blank spaces. So like anytime someone stops talking, it just automatically gets rid of that the spacing. And so if it takes time for someone to answer a question or something, it's just like right away, boom, boom, boom. There's no like dead space. And I think that's really cool. I'd love to see AI help edit this, because I already just stumbled and fucked up like the last couple sentences, and I'm not going to get rid of it just for the purpose of this. But I do heavily edit, so I'd love to see how that's like edited. But full AI hosts, I don't know. That seems a little dystopian to me, especially if they are spreading information, because like it just seems like, I don't know. There's something about that I don't think people will trust. People already distrust technology and tech companies and AI as it is.
I agree. But at the same time, we're talking to Alexa and we're asking Alexa to buy our groceries for us, right? So, it's just like asking Alexa, what are the news headlines for today? Same sort of deal.
Okay. So rather than Alexa being the host and like...
Yeah. It's more of like, it's kind of replacing a host in a way because you're getting information. I don't know. I'm very curious to see like how
that intersects. Yeah,
how that intersects, because I don't know yet, but I do think that there is something there.
Totally.
And I totally agree about the editing process. I am actually interested in building that eventually one day. Maybe we'll see.
That's the next iteration for you guys. Start a tech company and then get acquired by Spotify. Calling it right now.
That would be nice. I would love to get acquired by Spotify. If you're listening, Spotify, please buy us. But yeah, no, for sure. We'll see what happens in the future. Yeah. I think other than that, I'm just excited to like go to a restaurant like normally again and like hug people normally and not like ask if I can go to the bathroom in my friends' homes without feeling like uncomfortable because of the COVID situation.
Yeah. Or in general, like, hey, are you comfortable to even come over? You can come over in my backyard if you're comfortable. It's weird. I don't know how long this will last. I don't know how long this will last, but there is definitely going to be a weird social stigma around it for a while.
Yeah, like I think one day, I hope like in the next 5 years, like we'll all be laughing about this. It's like, haha, remember when I had to ask you to sit on my balcony? Like, you know what I mean? Like it's just like a really weird situation. But I don't know. I hope that it goes away soon because I do think that like, although like all this virtual and digital stuff is amazing, I think there's nothing that can really replace like face-to-face human interaction. So
yeah, conferences are not going to go away. I can't wait to go to one, all these big industry events. It's just not the same online. It's great. It's convenient. And I really hope they still adopt it to, help lower emissions from people flying all around the world and give access to people who can't afford a ticket or don't want to fly or, just give everyone the access to these events. So, and I know with that, you are doing some traveling tomorrow to Vancouver. Yeah. So, best of luck with that. Stay safe. And I hope you wear a mask on the plane.
I have to. It's mandatory. So, yep, absolutely. I'm excited.
Thank you so much for coming and giving me your time and giving me your awesome tools and tactics. This has been amazing. And I thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was really fun.